his beloved Akka as part of the 1948 Nakba. To recognize this loss, we played songs on the Nakba and about the great Palestinian city of Akka, that you heard as you entered the room today. We are hosting this annual event in May this year as the culmination of a month-long programming series commemorating the 75th year since the start of the Nakba, and outlines the long road ahead in the path of Palestinian freedom. And on this note, I would like to extend a special acknowledgement to Dr. Abdul Ghaffar Musa, who honored us and his daughter Jumana with their presence at our Nakba 75th commemoration event last week. Dr. Musa, your presence means the world to us. Thank you for honoring us with your attendance. Despite the loss and dispossession of Palestinians beginning with the Nakba, we also recognize and honor the perseverance of our people in all realms. Not only is the Jerusalem Fund committed to providing relief for Palestinians as a necessary first step towards their dignified empowerment, its Palestine Center was started, this space, by Professor Sharabi to bring Palestinian voices to Washington, D.C. And the Palestine Center has been and continues to be a space for Palestinians, Arabs, and those who work in service of liberation to share their experiences, their knowledge, and expertise, and exchange ideas for the betterment of our societies from the United States to the Arab region. Okay, in 1994, a graduate student at Georgetown University co-interviewed Hisham Sharabi for the Arab Studies Journal. The interviewers asked Professor Sharabi to identify the challenges presented to those who study the Arab world and how to overcome them. Sharabi replied that one of the challenges, and I quote, is to be found in the classroom and in the mode of instruction practiced in it. Here, instruction is largely based on the concepts and methods of area studies and a vocabulary long transcended in other disciplines. This is why serious students with above average awareness need to put in more time and greater independent effort to find a way for devising their own conceptual and methodological approaches. End quote. It seems that Sharabi's interviewer agreed that there was, in fact, a need for new methodological and pedagogical approaches to Arab world studies. The graduate student I mentioned is none other than our speaker today, Professor Bassam Haddad. We have much to learn from his accomplishments. Professor Haddad's scholarship, institution building, and fostering of knowledge production in service of a better future in the Arab region and beyond. These are all reasons why we are so thrilled to hear from him tonight. More specifically, Professor Haddad is the founding director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program and associate professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He is the author of Business Networks in Syria, The Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience, published in 2011, and is the co-editor of A Critical Political Economy of the Middle East, published in 2021. Bassam is co-founder and co-editor of Jadaliyya, and is the executive director of the Arab Studies Institute. He serves as the founding editor of the Arab Studies Journal and the Knowledge Production Project. He is co-producer and director of the award-winning documentary film About Baghdad, a remarkable work which we are proud to have in our collection here at the Palestine Center. He is the director of the acclaimed three-part documentary series Arabs and Terrorism. Bassam served on the board of the Arab Council for the Social Sciences and the executive director and the executive producer of Status audiovisual podcast. He is also the executive editor, of the Knowledge Production Project and director of the Middle East Studies Pedagogy Initiative, MESPI. He received Mesa's Jur La Bacharach Service Award in 2017 for his service to the profession. And currently, he is working on his second Syria book titled Understanding the Syrian Tragedy, Regime, Opposition, Outsiders, forthcoming with Stanford University Press. Professor Haddad's lecture tonight will focus on the intertwining themes of anti-imperialism and anti-authoritarianism, particularly as they relate to Syria and Palestine amid more than a decade of uprising, counter-revolution, and international intervention in the region. Professor Haddad will delve into the role the question of Palestine played in discussion and debates around the Syrian case within the ever-changing context of the Middle East, including China's growing involvement. Additionally, he will provide insight into the intricate dynamics of the Syrian case, where the juxtaposition of contrasting local, regional, and international state and non-state actors unsettled historical paradigms of revolution and resistance. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Bassam Haddad.
Masal khair. Good evening. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Jihad, and everyone at the Jerusalem Fund for putting together this event. I am in awe of so much around this event, not least the memorial of Hisham Sharabi, my ex-professor at Georgetown University, and so much more, and I'll say a bit about that in just a moment. And thanks to all the wonderful faces that are here that I don't know and the ones that I know as well. Is this the person who wants to sell you something? Ammu Abed? They were trying to sell something. I dedicate this talk to Professor Hisham Sharabi and to my mother, Asmahan, who passed a few years ago. She worshipped Palestine and taught us all what fortitude meant. And also to Adnan and Rabab Usta, as well as to Dr. Musa, all Nakba survivors who were honored at the Nakba event that Jihad addressed. Thank you all for your presence. We are empowered by your resilience every day. I am grateful for this opportunity to address this topic that has been quite central to discussions and debates on the Syrian uprising, but it was not always addressed explicitly, making for an even more complicated discursive terrain. I have to admit that I may have bitten more than I could chew in one talk, given the title here, which is The Syrian Uprising and the Question of Palestine, Navigating Anti-Imperialism and Anti-Authoritarianism. This much will become clear quite fast, actually. To avoid promising too much, I intend to foreground the main issues in this talk and can address more in the Q&A. I might have to remove some sections as I move forward. I do realize that many are waiting to hear the substance on the Syrian uprising and the question of Palestine. I will get there. I've been getting there for a dozen years now. But I imagine we need to pause a bit to address the context within which this relationship takes place. So please bear with me. First, however, I'd like to say a few words about my relationship with Hisham Sharabi, which I was asked to address, and I'm very happy I was. You can read about his brilliance and impact, which is also partly why many of you, of course, are here. Surely we are familiar or have read diligently his remarkable body of work and witnessed his impact beyond the classroom and academia. Besides his celebrated book, Neo-Patriarchy, among others, I personally was influenced by his attempt to theorize the Arab world, hence my interest in a book he edited under the title Theory, Politics, and the Arab World, and similar works that bridged paradigms while dismantling others. But I will preserve the next few words and anecdotes to the lighter side, the more personal dimensions. Professor Sharabi was a teacher and a mentor, as well as someone who, for reasons I didn't get at the time, would routinely invite me and my friends, including my best friend Sinan Antoun and Ibrahim Ali, among others, as well as our significant others who shall remain nameless, to his home for occasional casual dinners and drinks, where occasionally other people we used to read would be in attendance, people like Halim Barakat, Adonis, and many others. Yeah, they were mostly dudes, I have to say. And yes, even giants of the day would be in attendance at Hisham Sharabi's home, as he was a towering figure, always rocking reprimanding eyes. It didn't matter how big or famous you are, when they're around him, it felt like they're in his classroom. We also would invite him over to our homes, and to our amazement, he would come almost every time. We had memorable and unforgettable experiences with Dr. Sharabi in the classroom and at his home or ours. We still revel in some of these memories, Sinan and I. I can literally go on for a long time sharing stories that will change the nature of this event, but don't worry, I will not. I will just share a couple of instances. We all suspected he had an acerbic sense of humor, but we're not quite sure, because Hisham carried himself like he is beyond reach, at least when I met him in the 1990s. We've had several incidents. One of them, I'll share a couple. One time at Sinan's house, he was invited to dinner and everyone was talking about politics. And then somebody jumped in and said something about something social. So Hisham looked at them, and of course there was silence in the room. And he goes, خلينا هلأ بالسياسة بعدين اجتماعيات. So basically, everyone followed. Let's keep talking about politics and then we'll go to social matters. And that was a very interesting moment that we still recall. Another moment, at one point, and when I was taking a graduate seminar with him, auditing actually, because Sinan and I would audit his and Hanna Batatu's courses for fun. He was talking about Marx and communism. There was an impasse in the discussion. So he elected to schedule an additional session outside class. After setting the time for the session, he looked around the table to make sure everyone can attend, and he said, "Let me know if you have a class conflict." While everyone shuddered at the thought of not acquiescing to the time, I naturally looked at him and said out loud, "Class conflict?" referencing the discussion on Marx. He also naturally paused, turned around, and stared at me for a few seconds with his typical charismatic face and posture. I was not sure whether he was resisting laughing or meditating about how he is going to murder me or kick me out of the classroom. You could hear a pin drop. After what seemed to be ages, he turned around and continued his lecture. That's it. That's the story. He would have made an outstanding poker player. I'll reserve other stories to other times. I'll start with addressing the impasse that I discuss. It's going to be a long talk. So if you have coffee, there's also coffee and tea over there. If you have drugs that arouse, please feel free, because it's going to be a pretty long ride and not always a pretty one, given the subject matter. Today, I'll address how discussions and debates around the Syrian uprising involved the Palestine question, at least for some, for good or for ill. The uprising was against decades of political repression and an exploitative neoliberal turn by the Syrian regime. But the counter-revolution, if you will, centered the question of Palestine as an imperialist and/or colonial extension. First and foremost, I would like to ask you to imagine with me as we navigate these matters, rather than simply parse out the details about authoritarianism, imperialism, neoliberalism, colonialism, and so on. We have to imagine basically the moment. We have to imagine the motivations of various groups. We have to imagine the heat of that moment, which I am glad that we're not in right now for many, many reasons, so we can reflect and think and even talk to each other, because we couldn't talk to each other at the time during the Syrian uprising. Irrespective of how precise some of these terms and adjectives are, it is a recipe for controversy. But we should not walk away These terms will be deployed again and again, and the dynamic animating anti-authoritarianism and anti-imperialism is happening in various parts of the world today. This dynamic is here to stay so long as dissent vis-a-vis authoritarian regimes continue to take place in a context where imperial powers will pounce on the opportunity to leverage legitimate concerns for their own ends. And we will understand it less, much less resolve it, if we are not having a serious discussion about how imperialism and authoritarianism, however defined, are indeed intertwined. Specifically, how the context within which these contradictions take place is global capitalism on the one hand, and on the other, how emancipatory solidarity and formulas continue to be restricted by the juridical and political organizing principle of the nation state. And these two, global capitalism and the nation state, are now firmly and organically linked, hence the perennial intractability. In the context of the Syrian uprising, especially among those who supported it in principle, the debates were governed, delimited, as well as sabotaged by the very simple fact that a victory of any one camp over another had to be fitted into the nation-state outcome, which reposes the same problems and legally administers the same constraints, whoever wins. This is a critique of the concept of the nation-state, if this was not clear. How else can you explain the return of the Syrian regime to the Arab League, where some of the same parties that were prosecuting the war against it are present and often welcoming? The nation state itself as a concept and reality, and how it can or may be put to use by an international or regional system of capital, is often more important or lucrative than its ideology or even actions, exposing repeatedly the limitations of the nation state for emancipatory politics, which explains how those who supported the uprising against the Syrian regime were some of the same parties who bankrolled it for decades, and the same parties, or some of the same parties, who now are back in the same camp. The same applies to the question of Palestine and Israel's settler colonial existence. While envisaging an exit or a solution to the question of Palestine might lead to self-determination of a people within the framework of the nation state, this framework, the nation state, will not result in self-determination for all people within it, within the existing global political economy where capital is king or queen. Don't get me wrong, it would be a tectonic shift if this happens, not least in the context of one secular democratic state for all in Palestine. So why navigate? How to navigate these poles of anti-authoritarianism and anti-imperialism? Short of proposing an alternative principle to the international state system for organizing the world, let us just be cognizant of the contradictions that always already exist even prior to conflicts or revolutions. One problem is that occasional and many close observers do not consider the nation state as a problematic starting point to begin with in and of itself. We can leave this discussion to another annual lecture. The main dynamic I would like to move on to now is that of anti-authoritarianism and anti-imperialism. One can easily claim to oppose both, but that's simplistic and theoretical, as well as divorced from the real-world experiences we witness where the two forces collide, imperialism and authoritarianism, such as when the United States set out to invade Iraq 20 years ago. Most of us didn't just say we oppose both the imperialism of the United States and the authoritarianism of the Iraqi regime. Even if we put all these words in quotation marks, it's all the same. People the world over adopted a position vis-a-vis the invasion. So opposing both, while sound in principle, is practically a cop-out in most cases where people intend to take a position or action on that particular and immediate question. Hence the importance of this theme, which has been recurring in the past decades and wreaked havoc in some cases, such as the Syrian uprising, again, for good or for ill. In this century alone, this dynamic played out repeatedly in the region and around the world, with Iraq, Iran, Libya, and Afghanistan as some regional examples. One can highlight the paramount case of Syria, but also Iran and Libya specifically, where the situation demanded a position other than simply opposing all these bad things or on principle when it came to specific policies or actions, like actual sanctions or invasions. We all had to justify our position on specific questions we chose to answer, and this is where the navigation in the title is paramount. And it's a moving target. One can oppose the US sanctions on Iran, which are penalizing the Iranian public, while supporting the recent mass protests against the Iranian government. Same with the gargantuan sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s. The same applies also to Syria, where one can support the democratic uprising initially, but oppose imperial intervention on all sides. Of course, I bring up the case of Syria because it had gotten more complicated after the first stage of the uprising, and became more of a full-fledged proxy war, which is precisely when, where, and why navigation became tricky, destroying friendships, political solidarities, and even familial relations. I don't want to descend into polemics today. We have all had enough. Rather, I would like to highlight how actors viewed themselves and justified their actions in the context of perceived imperialism and authoritarianism. Talking about imperialism is a can of worms. We know it exists, and its impact on the world has been calamitous. But not everything is imperialism on the one hand, and the interventions we like get absolved from being labeled as such on the other. Many of those critical of US imperialism and its heavy involvement in the Syrian conflict had little to say about Russia's intervention and imperialism. And Russia is not Oman. It is an imperial force par excellence, and more so recently. Furthermore, imperial powers certainly don't see themselves as imperial, even as they proverbially, and I wasn't born here, proverbially and otherwise may be ruling the world or dispossessing whole nations. Imperial powers often self-appoint their role as a mission they must pursue to save the world. The same applies to authoritarianism, on the other hand. It's a slippery concept considering how it might apply more ubiquitously than many of us think, apply more ubiquitously to other countries that are not thought of as authoritarian from the get-go. A good definition of authoritarian rule puts it on a continuum which touches many of the supposed democratic countries. And because the term dictatorship or authoritarianism gets often thrown around to accomplish policy objectives, nearly always associating authoritarian rule implicitly or explicitly with some cultural essence of a people, usually brown people, it continues to be mired in as much controversy as imperialism. As with imperial powers, authoritarian regimes also don't see themselves as such, even as most of their populations shudder at the thought of a serious public critique of the head of state, to say the least. Despite a grain of truth, authoritarian regimes are often excused, not just explained, with reference to colonial legacies and the dominance of great powers, even as they crush domestic groups or whole populations that are far more principled in opposing colonialism and imperialism than the regime that purports to be fighting these demons. In both cases of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and anti-authoritarianism, or imperialism and authoritarianism, accountability evaporates, people get crushed, the environment is degraded, self-determination eradicated or postponed, identities are denied, humanity simmers on the back burner. So to talk about both imperialism and authoritarianism becomes immediately controversial, often impossible to address without descending into polemics, leaving one very few friends. But fear not. I try in this talk to water down the controversy by bringing in the Syrian uprising. And for good measure, as if I were a sadomasochist bent on polemical self-destruction, I added another component around which the discussion revolves: Palestine. So it is quite of a mix. I'm getting old, so I'm totally fine losing all my friends by the end of this talk. Again, short of a treatise now on the topic, I simply want to affirm based on ample historical examples and research, that imperialism and authoritarianism usually feed off one another, each using the other to justify its exploits, even if the scale of damage each may cause is fit to size. Authoritarian regimes of the global South generally have less of an impact on the world than imperial power. Both do not exist in a vacuum in all cases. Imperialism and authoritarianism cannot be seen as distinct from global capitalism, as I shared, which constitutes their dominant structure of incentives. Things don't just happen. We don't just have imperial powers and authoritarian regimes and then events happen. There is a dominant structure of incentives called global capitalism, which structures and restructures things in ways that seem so contradictory to us if we're not aware of the linkages. Hence, again, the return of the Syrian regime to the Arab League, as if nothing happened. Global capitalism also enhances the ability of each to exploit its context while providing ample justification for its actions with supporters to boot. China is a solid example. The Syrian case is but a symptom of this unending canvas. I will try to provide some background, but I will refrain from offering answers. To be sure, the topic broke up friendships, as I shared, political solidarities, and even familial relations. The more we approach it with humility, the more we can achieve some understanding, and one hopes common purpose for what we might do together next, under changing circumstances and when similar situations arise, and they will. We didn't do a great job this time around, in my view, when it came to catastrophes like the Syrian uprising. For my part, I'm speaking as a longtime Syrian observer or analyst, now approaching 30 years of continuous study of the country and its history. I'm also intimately connected to Syria through familial relations on my mother's side, as well as through decades of yearly visits to Syria. Not only was I part of conversations and debates around the Syrian uprising, but I also witnessed the crumbling and divisiveness in my network of family, friends, and colleagues living in Syria at the time, and surely outside Syria, where the debates are infinitely more poisonous, petty, and less productive, because there's much less at stake, and where grandstanding is essentially inconsequential. In addition to my daily work with Jadaliyya, from the first moment Syrians protested in Damascus and Dar'a in March 2011, I maintained active contact with my then existing interlocutors, in addition to new ones inside Syria, who did not always see eye to eye with each other, even if they proceeded from the same political orientation, except on the one immovable matter, opposition to the Syrian regime. Unfortunately, I was not allowed in Syria after 2011 precisely because of my writings in Jadaliyya, as well as the publication of my book during that same year. The book constituted the background to my research on the uprising and beyond, which also is part of the background to my discussion today. Titled Business Networks, the Political Economy of Authoritarian Resilience, my first book examined the regime's neoliberal exploitation of the country and its people since the mid to late 1980s until 2011, as it colluded with and created its own business class in its own image. The book foreshadowed the background to the uprising, if not the timing, by examining regime policies that exponentially polarized Syrian society and did away gradually with the one thing that compensated for its heavy-handed rule and policing, and that is social safety nets and an accompanying sense of what I have called leveling egalitarianism, where people are not doing great, but doing it mostly in a relatively close socioeconomic and social proximity to one another. This completely shattered in the 90s and certainly after 2003 and 2005, when the Bashar regime consolidated itself after the passing of his father. The legacy, institutional practice, and social impact of state-business relations in Syria from 1989 to 2010, 2011 played a significant role in setting the stage for mass discontent among the Syrian public. Notably, the eruption of the Tunisian and Egyptian uprisings had a remarkable domino effect, including on Syria, and catalyzed mass protests that may have taken longer to coalesce absent such show of solidarity in the face of decades of repression. No one thought that this Syrian uprising would actually take place in 2011, absent the other cases of uprisings. How did we move from here to one of the more intractable and prolonged cases of uprisings in Syria? And what was the role of the question of Palestine? Ordinarily, the Syrian uprising is sufficiently controversial on its own, not the beginning, to be sure, on which there was not much controversy and a lot of consensus, but how it developed over the years. The question of Palestine, among other factors, has endowed the Syrian uprising with added complexity. It played a significant, even if not always explicit, role in the Syrian uprising. It did so notably among those who became skeptical about how the uprising developed, at least strategically. It might appear that the Palestine-Israel conflict was in the background, but it is actually very much an implicit part of the calculus of nearly all players, from the US, Syria, Russia, Iran, and certainly Saudi Arabia, which had at the time been getting closer to Israel, as we later discovered even more deeply. Although most parties to the Syrian conflict have, at one point or another, championed the cause of Palestine, it is primarily what can be called the resistance camp that made it part of its canon of argument for why the opposition is suspect, because it had, according to that narrative, external ties to regional and international interests and states that quietly did the bidding of Israel, not least the United States, which, contrary to many who made it a sport to understate its involvement, was actually deeply involved in significant aspects of the Syrian uprising from the very beginning, including the signaling it provided as an empire, as the most powerful state in history, the signaling it provided for all other actors who either supported or opposed the uprising. The Palestine question was also referenced by the opposition camp. And of course, there are many oppositions, but I'm referring to the opposition that was, for the most part, aligned itself with Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. For their part, that opposition, its various factions, have originally referred to the Palestine-Israel conflict to compare the brutality of Israel to the brutality and military as well as discursive methods of the Syrian regime, and pointed out at the time the double standards of Hezbollah based on its intervention on the regime's behalf in crushing the uprising, an intervention that has objectively compromised its image among many of its supporters in the region. The opposition rightly pointed out the fantastic claim, problematic fantastic claim by the regime during the first weeks of the uprising that the protesters are either terrorists, Islamist extremists, or foreign agents, when in reality, the early euphoric stage or months of the uprising was dominated by a wide and diverse cross-section of the Syrian population, regardless of who else joined. Unfortunately, many among the initial supporters of the uprising who later withdrew their support adopted that narrative, belying their own involvement at the outset. In the very beginning, a lot of the critics were actually on board with the uprising. When it changed course, they completely adopted the opposite narrative, which was very odd. Not everybody who became skeptical of the direction of the uprising went this route in all cases. Over the years, and not ironically, most Syrians were much less concerned with these rhetorical devices coming at them from all sides, and far more concerned with the procuring means for decent survival, or just survival, amid the killing, destruction, and economic destitution engulfing Syria. This concern is even more pronounced today, including among former regime supporters who have grown increasingly vocal against the regime and its failed promises in return for their support during the uprising. The destitution that engulfs Syria today is almost unspeakable. In all cases, at the time, uprising skeptics, a diverse category to be sure, were not driven by support for the regime, for the most part. Indeed, like nearly everyone else, save the regime's natural supporters, they supported the eruption of the uprising, to be sure, but tampered or withdrew their support based on how the uprising transformed into a proxy war. Mostly, the charge was against the forces and actors amassed behind the uprising, namely Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and the United States, with Israel being viewed as a silent partner who ironically was less gung-ho than some of the other actors mentioned here. I'll address this shortly. But the question of Palestine, resistance to imperialism, and the militant rebels who had, or as a goal, the establishment of a theocratic state, were viewed as an extension of essentially conservative forces, those things animated the position of the critics, and indeed overdetermined it. They took that argument too far. To be exact, the totalitarian aspect of some of the leading Islamist rebel groups on the battlefield also took Syrians themselves by surprise, as this was viewed as a departure from the initial sentiments that produced the uprising. Not everyone was actually thinking about Palestine. Many actually resented how the regime exploited the cause of Palestine to justify its repression over the decades. To be clear, the roots, background, and causes that constitute the context of the Syria uprising are almost completely divorced from the question of Palestine in practice. People didn't go to the street or refrain from going to the street because of Palestine. That was not the issue at the time, at the eve of the uprising. That is, those who took to the streets again in the early weeks were on average as much of ardent opponents of Israeli apartheid and its subjugation of Palestinians as were supporters of the regime, or the regime itself for sure. Those who rose up were not in defiance of Syria's traditional hostility to Israel, often the opposite. Many of those on the streets were themselves critics of the Syrian complacency, the Syrian regime complacency vis-a-vis Israel for decades, save for its support of proxy resistance. Against these now commonly accepted simple facts, much obfuscation was peddled during the heat of the uprising that even sober observers were at pains to distinguish fact from fiction. But the big questions linger and are louder than the propaganda or willful blindness that reproduced the same narratives, just as reality was moving in the opposite direction. One question is, how did we get to the point where a popular uprising against a regime that has been historically brutal in preserving itself become a target of skepticism? Another way to pose the question is, how can such a regime that has arguably alienated most of its own original social base throughout the decades end up triumphing over what started out as a popular uprising? How did this happen? If there was one place one could assume that a successful uprising would be a no-brainer, it was Syria. And not only because of the violence of the regime, was prepared, not only because of the violence, the regime was prepared. It's all about intonation. Not only because of the violence of the regime was prepared to unleash at the sight of any threat, but also because of its neoliberal-like economic reforms, crony capitalism, dramatic reduction of subsidies prior to the uprising, and profound mismanagement of crises, including the horrible drought of the first decade of this century, all of which have successfully put most Syrians squarely on the opposite side of the regime and its die-hard supporters. In colloquial terms, how bad did the uprising get? How far removed was it from its initial track a few years in, say by 2014 or 2015? Who was actually spearheading it on the battlefield? These questions point to how the uprising developed and gradually transformed from a legitimate and popular call for democracy to a proxy war where regional and international players competed to redraw the political map of the region using Syria as pivot. The proof is in the pudding. If you consider those who have perished between 2011 and 2016, when the heaviest hostilities had taken place, you will find that about 80,000 Syrians were killed per year. These do not include those injured, maimed, paralyzed, permanently affected physically in one way or another. That number is far higher. In addition, we have witnessed the displacement of more than 12 million Syrians, sometimes twice or thrice displaced. About half of them have inevitably left Syria altogether and sought refuge in Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and beyond. Many died during their journey, knowing full well that was the potential fate they might face beforehand. The physical destruction that Syria endured is also colossal. Two major cities have been turned to rubble for the most part, Homs and Aleppo. essentially by the regime and later Russian firepower. Later, Al-Raqqa was leveled by US firepower. Entire neighborhoods and small towns have been severely damaged in the Idlib and Dir'a provinces around Damascus, throughout northeast Syria and elsewhere. Thousands of schools, hospitals, and other establishments necessary for the sustenance of social life had been destroyed or rendered useless. Scores of other infrastructure, from roads and bridges to refineries and factories, have also been transformed to rubble and scattered concrete Beyond the tangible, Syrians in war-torn areas, notably those exposed to air raids by the regime and later Russia, raining missiles and barrel bombs, but also exposed to death from the regime's enemies, have all suffered profound psychological traumas akin to many of those who suffered a similar experience in World War II. Entire worldviews, much more dreams, have been shattered. Most of the remaining Syrians have seen large parts of their worlds and families come apart, disintegrate, and sometimes disappear. The less fortunate have seen their income melt further, preventing them from doing more than merely survive. This was also a major cause that drove Syrians to the lapse of militant groups who offered lucrative monthly salaries. Why am I recounting this? Calamities of this scale do not just happen in an ordinary confrontation between the state and its local opposition. Calamities of this scale do not just happen in an ordinary confrontation between a state and its local opposition. Soon after the eruption of the civilian uprising, the confrontation was an all-out conventional war in which more than 150,000 pro-regime fighters and civilians were also killed. The total number of casualties from all causes is well over 500,000. Some say 1 million, and there are some fantastic numbers. It doesn't matter. These are very huge numbers. And though the Palestine-Israel conflict or Palestine question has not come explicitly to the fore, it represented a concrete symbol and rationale for action among those who saw the defeat of the Syria, Iran, Hezbollah camp as a victory for Israel, and worse yet, as the first step of unhindered and now unhinged dominance of Israel in the region. And though there was no consensus among supporters of the opposition on the question of Palestine, there was consensus on defeating or degrading the trio, Syria, Hezbollah, Iran. And at least in the minds of the pro-regime camp, such defeat would tear apart any institutional military complex that would balance Israel's power in the region, and by connection, eradicate further not just an equitable solution to the question of Palestine, but also the deepening of ethnic cleansing, displacement, and annexation without as much as a peep within 1,000-mile radius. Such were the arguments that favored the resilience of the Syrian regime, whether people liked the regime or not, and its allies. Such were the arguments that favored the resilience of the Syrian regime and its allies over the militant rebels and their state supporters and sponsors, considered imperial par excellence. Sadly, that same camp had no problem with Russia's imperialism, but that's another matter. The more intricate issue is that it was not the Syrian regime in and of itself that was being defended, so it would balance Israel's power. Away from rhetoric, Syria as a state has itself not constituted a real threat to Israel since the early 1980s, and some say since the October War of 1973. Syria was not being kept alive because Syria did the bidding with Israel directly. In fact, there is no wonder that Israel, or various voices and powers within Israel, did not squarely seek an absolute toppling of the Syrian regime during the uprising. That was, and perhaps always will be, a contingent desire within Israel if you follow the Israeli press and government discourse. Israel wanted to reduce any possible threat that comes in the way of its ethnic cleansing of Palestine, but not if the Syrian regime will be replaced by another that does not keep to their side of the border as well as the Syrian regime did for decades. The Syrian regime had barely fired a shot across its southern border with Israel for that long. Jolan, what Jolan? From the beginning, it seemed Israel was not convinced by the arguments that toppling Assad was necessary under any circumstances. It wanted a regime that is sufficiently strong to keep its people down, but one that is not strong enough to pose a threat to Israel. Today, it has gotten that, with the exception that Syria's geographic and geostrategic role in empowering Hezbollah, Israel's only remaining proximate and real threat, hence its continued belligerent bombing of weapon transfer targets and weapon depots inside Syria headed to Hezbollah or intended for Hezbollah. Israel was and continues to be truly concerned in security terms for the past few decades with Hezbollah, at least per Israeli government think tank and popular as well as media discourses. This concern is not just an intellectual point or observation. It is part of the linchpin that ties the Syrian uprising to the Palestine conflict over and above the reduced emotional clout Hezbollah wields today in the region or its own country of origin, Lebanon, compared to, say, 2006, because of its intervention in Syria and the gap it laid out between its prior commitments to liberation, say, of Palestine and how it intervened in the Syrian uprising on behalf of the dictatorship. Whether the manner in which this resistance camp sees its connection to both imperialism and the question of Palestine is on point, in other words, whether these narratives are on point, is not the issue, at least in this discussion. The issue would be if this was not indeed a motivation of theirs at all. One can argue with some certitude, however, that there is another rationale for opposing the uprising and the imperial forces behind it, in reference to Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah, which is survival. One can argue this pretty clearly based on the actual realpolitik that one can observe in the region and their proclamations. In fact, this is precisely one of the reasons this camp was fighting to the death and ultimately survived. The other reason, of course, is Russia's firepower and the clout and its clout since their own imperial counter-intervention in 2015, which allowed the final blow against the half of Aleppo that was actually controlled by the rebels, which was ended in December 2016, primarily because of Russia's intervention. In all cases, compared to the supporters of the uprising, who saw the conflict and their role in strategic terms, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and the US, supporters of the regime saw it in existential terms, a differential that became evident as the stakes grew higher, where one side lost a sense of the prize while the other continued to be always already motivated by the necessity of fighting till the end. By contrast, supporters of the uprising were more casual, strategic. The media war between Qatar and Saudi Arabia over who weaponized, militarized, Islamicized, and radicalized the uprising is the most instructive in not only providing unprecedented research material to cover blind spots, but also reveals how these actors were in it to win the outcome politically, with little regard for the Syrian people or the democracy protesters sought to replace the dictatorship with. So they were in line with the regime supporters in not caring about the one thing that we should all care about, which is the majority of the Syrian people, all the Syrian people. After all, until the 11th hour in March 2011, both of these states, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, for instance, had bankrolled the Syrian regime on and off for decades. Same with the United States, which is clearly not fit to support a democratic uprising in the region, considering its 7-decade-long support for dictatorship there and until this very moment. For their part, state supporters of the regime never claimed to be themselves democratic nor intervening to support democracy. They're not. So they win the anti-hypocrisy contest regarding democracy, but like the other side, they all lose the moral one in Syria, including Hezbollah, with the Syrian population posing as the biggest colossal victim in that horrendous calamity. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Bassam. All right. Thank you so much for this. Again, it's really important to understand. This is a place that is named the Palestine Center, and for us, Palestine doesn't exist in a vacuum. And your presentation, your lecture, definitely highlighted the layers of complexities that Palestine is surrounded with, and we need to consider when thinking about not only as Palestinians and thinking about our cause and our struggle for liberation, but also in terms of thinking about how do we relate to the context, to the context in our close proximity, in the vicinity of the region where we reside. I have some questions for you, but I would love to hear from the audience. I'm sure people have a lot of questions. We have 2 questions from the Ariqats, which I will definitely honor. But feel free to answer any questions. And I also, before I give the mic to the audience here, for our viewers online who are tuning in on Facebook or YouTube, if you have any questions also for Professor Haddad, please make sure to write them in the comments, and we will make sure to address them here. So which Ariqat family member should we start with? We'll start with Saeed, given Shabab. Thank you.
Thank you, Jihad, and thank you, Professor Bassam, and thank you for mentioning Esma. She is a dear friend whom I miss. I miss her charm. I miss her presence. I miss her passion for Palestine and for Arab nationalism, which we both share. So thank you for that. Also, I just want to say that the first time I met Hisham Sharabi was in the late 60s. I was a student and he came and spoke at my university of San Francisco. So, I've known him for a very long time. Syria is a place that is very dear to me. It's a place where I visited a great deal every year, many times. It's a place where I got married. It's a place where I got arrested, and things of that nature. So, right. So it's a place where my oldest brother went to college for free and was educated and so on. So that was Syria in every sense. It was a place that was open for all Arabs to come and live and go to school and do all these things and get medical care and all these things. I must say that, I, for one, and I think you and I have spoken about this issue before, I was never taken by the so-called popular uprising. I never saw it that way. I knew the sentiments of the Syrians. I met a lot of Syrians over the years, but I knew also that the United States of America has always applied it against Syria. I mean, it's something that I have discussed with American diplomats. The last Syrian ambassador, who was before that deputy ambassador in Iraq, and I met him there and so on. So I don't want to delve into this, but we need to remember that Syria, before this thing, was a country that had zero debts. It was providing for its people. It was producing everything. It was exporting drugs and medicines and so on to 93 countries. I can go on and on and on. And I know that in this town, right after the invasion of Iraq, the most popular sentiment is, when are we going to Syria? It was people like Bill Kristol and others, the Winner people, the other people, the AIPACers and so on. They were always saying, when are we going to Syria next? We all remember the 14 points that were submitted by Colin Powell to Syria. So, I don't buy this thing. Of course, there was sentiment. And there was, people hate authoritarianism, and there was a strong sentiment. But almost from day one, the plot was to do to Syria what they have done to Syria. And, imagine for a moment if the state and the army were not able to withstand this war. It was almost a global war. Lloyd Austin himself, in a Senate hearing, he said that they trained 100,000. They spent, at that time, that was like 8 years ago when he was chairman, they spent over $500 million in training militants and so on that have morphed into ISIS and others. So I don't want to go on. My question, I have a question, and not just a sentiment to you, is this. Are we at the end of America's plotting against the Syrian state, or are we likely to see more of this thing? See, listening to Bob Menendez and Rich and others that go around sending letters and all these things to others. And my second question, would the Saudis have actually, returned to Syria, or, brought Syria back into the airfold without America's green light? Thank you.
Should we take them one question at a time or take multiple questions?
There's a lot here.
Okay.
Well, Ahlan Saeed. So basically, I have to say that I am not concerned with the plots the US has against Syria personally, even though I know they exist. And I'm not concerned because I'm just not concerned, period. Because at a time of a popular uprising against decades, not just of political repression and subjugation, but also neoliberal economic policies that impoverished a large number of Syrians for the sake of the few. I'm concerned with following this path that the Syrians who took to the streets wanted to take. So we have to be clear. We cannot just mix the bag and say, because there are designs on Syria, then we have to sort of, do X, Y, Z. Now, the fact that in reality, the actual uprising itself underwent change and was transformed in terms of who was taking to the streets and what they were doing and for what purpose. Yes, this is precisely why people like myself were skeptical, but not skeptical enough to stop supporting the idea and practice of a real revolution in Syria, but skeptical enough to take pause and to critique the divergence. We cannot be slaves to US designs, because US has designs everywhere. And if we do that, then we are not actually going to support any change in the region, because any change in the region is going to collide with US designs, or the US is going to try to subvert it for its own purposes. So on the one hand, I understand the designs, but that's not good enough reasons to sort of stop supporting the Syrian uprising. The reason I personally hit the brakes in supporting what was going on the ground is because what was going on the ground contradicted the Syrian uprising as it started the first few months and moved in a direction that was more totalitarian. I don't use the word jihadist or even Islamist or extremist because they're all problematic. The rebels spearheading the uprising in Syria after a couple of years were totalitarian, and they had no intention of doing what the people that took to the streets in the beginning wanted to do. That's why I was skeptical. The fact that there were US designs and the fact that Qatar and Saudi Arabia will actually move in the direction of what is lucrative to them is another story. And this is one of the reasons why when I spoke with one of my friends in Syria, dear friend, we met in Chicago. I gave a keynote at a University of Chicago at a conference. I was one of the speakers. And then I asked him, because he actually was part of the Syrian National Council who flew to Qatar back and forth and to Turkey back and forth. And I told him, why are you doing this? You basically historically have been critical of these countries and how they treated their own populations and how they supported Assad for decades. He basically said, we have no choice. We just have to go with whoever's helping us. It's basically was putting forth a realpolitik approach. And I said, okay, that's not so bad. But the calculus is wrong. This realpolitik approach that you're pursuing is not going to result in the toppling of Assad. When you have profoundly problematic states like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United States supporting an uprising, there's nothing good that's going to come out of it. So even the calculus from a devil's advocate approach or a realpolitik approach, where the means justify the end, is mistaken. The calculus is wrong. So you're losing reputation and you're going to lose the uprising. And of course, we never talked after. And this is what ended up happening. This is why I keep asking, how can this uprising fall apart when it is so easy to revolt against a repressive, brutal dictatorship like Syria's, not just politically, but also economically? And it's because of the problematic forces amassed behind the uprising, and partly because those of us, or many of us, or the people that supported the uprising, even after it changed course, didn't speak out, weren't as loud in condemning that shift in direction of the uprising. But I will not take US designs on the region to be my yellow card or red card, to be like, no, we cannot go on with this process of revolting against dictatorship. I think we must keep going, just like in the question of Palestine, we must keep going in the direction that is principled, regardless of who is on the other side. The US will always do what it does, and I will not go by, be guided by its designs. As to the other question, I don't know if Saudi Arabia took the green light from the United States to welcome Assad. I actually think that Saudi Arabia is hedging its bets. It's playing a smart game, literally a smart game now with the involvement of China, although I'm not sure how principled that game is. But right now, it seems that it's hedging its bets and it's trying to do what it wants to do. I think there is I'm not going to get into Saudi Arabia very much, but the leadership in Saudi Arabia has a vision that is apolitical, that is mostly economic in terms of Saudi Arabia's health and wealth and prosperity, and ultimately its political position. And it's actually open to peace, even with Iran, largely because it wants to preserve that vision. And the US right now and Saudi Arabia, you know more than I do, are not in good standing. And you had asked me about the connection with China. Of course, I mean, I'm not one of those people who think that, oh, China's here now, we have an opportunity to basically choose, or we have some sort of balance of power that we can leverage. I'm not as confident as many people, especially in the Arab world, especially on channels like Al-Malik Mayadeen and others, who many, not all, are assuming that, okay, now we are back to some sort of a bipolar global politics. I don't think we are there now, and I'm not one of those people who is confident about how China will actually be producing positive results for people in the region. So I'm skeptical as well.
We can bring you the mic.
I'm not going for certain option, but you are not sharing. What is your alternative option?
عم عدنان كنا قاعدين عم نحكي ومبسوطين. I mean, I am. The funny thing is that some of the revolutionaries that supported the Syrian uprising throughout the whole years, who were critiquing some of my statements about the direction of the uprising, you know, what was funny is that when from the early 1990s, 93, 94, up to now, I've devoted all my intellectual production on Syria to providing profound critique and condemnation of the Syrian regime. And people who just woke up to the notion of Syria in 2011 were, you know, taken aback by my critique of the direction of the uprising. My position is there needs to be a total and comprehensive change in the direction of emancipatory politics in the region, including and especially probably in Syria, and precisely for the sake of larger causes like the Palestine questions. Now, if this is happening, I'm all for it. But when this process begins to be diverted in a direction that will actually re-empower the Syrian regime, just like it did ultimately, because the Syrian regime have friends that will fight to the death to keep it alive, because they have an existential stake in it, then I am going to be skeptical about the direction of the uprising, but I maintain solidly my position in support of a revolution in Syria until today. So I have written about this and I shared what you asked me. Yes, my position is perhaps privileged. I'm sitting far away, and on principle, I'm not willing to change my position on the brutality of the Syrian regime, but I'm also not going to follow the direction of the uprising that was seeking, at least the spearhead of the uprising that was seeking a theocratic outcome that is in contradiction with everything about the uprising. So my position is with a revolution in Syria, but not the actual uprising that was taking hold after 2013.
I have a question from Noura, then Dr. Musa.
And that doesn't put me at all, as you heard, in the camp of those who actually take that argument so far to the point where it's as far as I'm concerned, they're two sides of the same coin.
I want to thank you for a very comprehensive talk. I think that you distilled a lot of emotional reaction and sentiment, and were able to parse through it using a tremendous amount of research and empirical data, which speaks to the work that you were nodding to. And as somebody that is a student and a comrade of yours, I still learned so much, and want to ask you a couple of follow-up questions to the things that you said that builds on what was asked before. Specifically, here's something that you said, and then I'll ask you two questions that flow from it. So you said calamities of this scale do not just happen between a state and its local population. You stated it twice to suggest what you weren't saying, which is what you suggested multiple times. There was a particular moment when this pivots from a popular uprising to a regional proxy war. And yet in previous iterations, you periodized that, I think, more clearly than we heard this time. So there was something about the first few months of the uprising, and then there was 2013 as a moment, and then 2014 and 2015 as a moment. So if you can more clearly, in your research, where do you pinpoint this pivot from popular uprising to regional proxy war, right? And then secondly, related to this question, you have a certain, all revolutions are messy. None are pure. So is there a moment where it got too far, where those who stayed involved just should have left? Was there a moment, what should they have tolerated as staying in? Because there's also something to be said for those who remained committed. They're not sheep. They have agency and knew what they were doing. What do we say of their agency and the decisions that they were making in the calculus of the messy versus what needed to happen?
This is coming.
Lecture number 2.
Very quickly. I actually, don't want to go through the prioritization because it becomes like, unwieldy, but I do, yes, the scale question that I shared is to make a point about proportionality, right? If a popular uprising within a country against a state that is armed to the teeth with policing capabilities and so on took place, there will be, of course, casualties among the repressive regime. But the scale of the casualties demonstrates that this is not just an uprising against a regime and then there are, consequences like casualties on both sides. Because in reality, the number of casualties on the regime side speaks to the intervention, and existence of a real war supported by actors way outside the local groups. So that point is simply to suggest that there is a transformation into a proxy regional and international war in a way that should allow us to look at the uprising as something other than what it was early on. And as a result, to wonder whether this path, especially considering the goals, the explicit goals, forget the behavior and forget the violence of some of the rebels, because they lived under the Assad regime and in many ways they were copying And this happens in revolutions and happen. That's not what I'm referring to, even though, we all, condemn those sorts of things. But what I'm referring to is that this opposition has, and speaking to your second question, this opposition on the street, on the ground, in the battlefield. I'm not talking about Syrians who actually are the victims and all of this, the victims of everyone, with the regime holding or bearing the primary responsibility for everything. But those spearheading the uprising on the battlefield change the direction of the uprising to something different. So I am not looking for a perfect revolution. In fact, of course, there's no such thing. But when the direction of the uprising or the demands of the revolt early on is actually completely reversed to something reprehensibly theocratic, reprehensibly authoritarian, reprehensibly violent, reprehensibly exclusionary, that's not an imperfect revolution. That's a different war altogether that is being fought on behalf of a sentiment, an ideology, an orientation, a goal that is completely divorced from the reasons why millions of Syrians took to the streets and fought bullets with their bare bodies.
We have a question from Dr. Musa, and then a question from the gentleman here in the middle.
Oh, thank you. Talking about the uprising, to me, this is all planned from the very beginning after 1973 war and almost devastated Israel. And even Diane wanted to his atomic bomb to get it to the war. Then they started planning, which we never do. They marginalized Egypt, and all these uprisings are all planned to destroy or weaken whatever you want to do in these countries around. And we saw the results of all of these. Then came the uprising in Syria, which was discussed all the time here. I was with it at the very beginning. I know I was in surgery all day, but when I go home, I read everything before I sleep. Then it's less than a year, it showed it was invented. And it showed to destroy Syria as they did to Iraq, as they did to Egypt, they did to everything. This is where I even stopped listening to Al Jazeera, and I never listened to Al Jazeera since then, because you can tell, and the only one who saved Syria, was the Soviet Union or Russia. At that time, it was no Soviet Union. So my question is, you tell me brutality and brutality. Show me any one of them who does not have a brutal regime, who does not kill, who does not do anything among all the Arab countries. Show me one. Saddam Hussein used to be in his cabinet meeting. If you say something against him, he will shoot you in the meeting. So why we want to get Bashar al-Assad or Hafiz al-Assad alone? They are all the same. Show me anyone. Thank you.
I can't show you anyone because they're all,
Huh?
I can't. They're all do the same things or similar things, but we're talking about an actual uprising in an actual case, and I support it. And I support its principles, and I still do. And going back to Noura's question, what about those people that continue to support the uprising? Well, guess what? I'm with these people. But if you ask these people, like I did, what are you supporting now? And they say, I'm supporting the revolution. And I asked, what revolution? And they say the revolution to overthrow the regime and replace it with a more inclusive and any just alternative. And I said, what about these people who are spearheading the actual battles on the ground? And they say, I don't support them, but I support the revolution. So I would say, well, me too. Now, yes, in the heat of the moment, people didn't make these distinctions, at least not publicly. They would speak of themselves as supporters of the revolution. But when you ask them, is the direction of Jabhat al-Nusra or Ahrar Sham or whatever it is that was at the time spearheading the battlefield. They say, no, this is not my cup of tea. We don't have any differences. It's just now it appears to be much more of a nomenclature question, whereby in the heat of the moment, those distinctions weren't made, but now they are being made. Now people are basically being very open about, these people almost stole the revolution from us. And the Syrians who persevered and fought to keep their towns and neighborhoods alive are the real heroes, but they were at home. If you ask them, and I'm talking about Syrians, and I kind of have to say there's a big difference between people like me living out here and all my interlocutors, friends or detractors, and then the people who are in Syria, who actually sidestepped all of our silly debates. Because if you ask them in Syria, which I did, because I'm in contact with them on a weekly, if not daily basis, how come you're not going to the streets anymore? And how come you're not choosing to go fight? And they are the ones who actually have been imprisoned by the regime, tortured by the regime, have relatives that are killed by the regime. They say, fight with whom? Right? So we're on the same page now, but during the uprising, the situation and the context and the atmosphere was so toxic, we couldn't actually get along. And Dr. Musa, no, I can't point to any regime, authoritarian regime, that doesn't have this behavior. I mean, we could say that Iraq first and then Syria, close second, have been historically more brutal. If you look at the statistics, have been historically more repressive. If you look at various statistics, I'm not talking about Random House Freedom Index, which is very problematic. I'm talking about the experience of real people in Syria, real men who are 40, 50, and 60 years old, who urinate in their pants when they have a knock on the door, simply because they know that they've written an article a week ago that was mildly critical of a second level functionary. That's what I'm referring to. This doesn't always happen in all authoritarian regimes. So there is a difference on the one hand, but no regime is free from these. Sorry? I'm with you. That's what I'm saying. No authoritarian regime has actually evaded that. And you bring up the question of Saudi Arabia, and I don't want to cause jihad and the center a problem, but we all know that if there is a serious movement in Saudi Arabia, it'll probably be the most regionally popular movement in the world against Saudi Arabia.
I want to thank you, Professor Haddad, for a really fantastic, illuminating lecture. I've been confused by the Syrian issue for a very long time. I remember the first time I saw or experienced the split that it created in the Palestine solidarity groups. I can't remember where I was. It was very early on. And the person, I was supposed to give a talk, and the person hosting the event apologized because half of the people that were supposed to come didn't come because he himself, I forget what his position was, but they opposed his position on Syria. And I thought, why aren't they coming to a talk about Palestine? Because they oppose somebody's opinion on Syria. So this was very early on. But my question to you is this, in connection to Palestine. Now that Syria is weakened, obviously, and licking its wound, is there a possibility that it will join the Abraham Accords? Because this is kind of in a way, a golden key to joining the kind of the regimes that are slightly safer, that are friends with the US, that have those kinds of privileges. So is there, and I think it would be a terrible thing, of course, but is this a realistic expectation that Syria would be the next to join the Abraham Accords?
No.
Elaborate.
I mean, everything about that camp, which includes Syria and Iran, of course, and Hezbollah, is antithetical to these accords. It just can't happen. Now, Saudi Arabia and the proximity that we've seen with Syria, I think, is part of a larger question that's happening in the region. So if you look at what's happening in Yemen vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, you'll see that there is, and of course, the deal, quotation marks, brokered by China, you'll see that there might be a trade-off between Iran and Saudi Arabia as to Syria and Yemen. You get your hands off of Yemen, I'll get my hands off of Syria. In other words, there is some sort of a trade-off, and you are also seeing developments that point in that direction, whereby you get Syria, I get Yemen, or you get your hands off Syria, I get my hands off Yemen. So there's that happening. And I think that dynamic is over and above other things that have to do with the United States and other topics. In fact, there is talk now, I mean, I don't know, these things could be reversed, that, you know, one of the actors that's not happy about what's happening is Israel, because Saudi Arabia was moving in a particular direction, fast, very fast. And now, I'm not sure if it's reversed that direction, but it's also moving in another direction. And I'm not one of those people who feel that this is not going to be reversed. I think this might actually, I'm one of the people who thinks this might be temporary. The entire Chinese involvement, the Iran, Saudi Arabia connection, I am not as confident as others in its durability.
It seems that some of the more, countries that are less likely to join the Abraham Accords, like, or to normalize with Israel, like Indonesia, Malaysia, even Pakistan, there are voices within those countries that are calling for normalization. And I'm wondering if it's not just a safe bet for the regime in Syria to join that.
Oh, I mean,
it wouldn't be a safe thing for them to do.
I don't think, I see what you're, okay. I don't think the regime's decision-making is autonomous. It wasn't autonomous to begin with years ago. It was connected to other considerations. But today, on these questions, it's certainly not autonomous. So it's not whether the regime wants or doesn't want. It's close allies, those who have actually literally saved it, will have a say. And I don't think this formula is on the cards, is in the cards. I don't think, I mean, I would be happy to be proven, not happy, actually, I wouldn't be very happy at all to be proven wrong, but I'll accept to be proven wrong, but I'll be extremely surprised if, because the Abraham Accords, I mean, have you read them? Just quiz.
I think almost everybody in the world was horrified by what happened in Syria and this just slow motion destruction and utter torture of the people. Obama should have never let the Russians fight in the Middle East. But I'm interested that you think that you actually do believe that the jihadis or the extremists had kind of taken over the movement, because I really wasn't very sure about that. Another thing that I
on the battlefield, I always reference the battlefield. On the battlefield, yeah.
But another thing that I really wonder how much of it played a part in it was the experience in Iraq, because Syria was the only place in the world where a brutal Shiite leadership ruled a large Sunni majority of populace. And, there really was a possibility that if that Assad had been overthrown, that there would have been a real serious massacre in that country, and probably, partially supported by all the Sunni countries around it. And how much do you think that was, maybe a contributor to the inaction of America and really the entire world, where we just watched these people just be bombed to whatever. And by the way, I'm a Russian expert. I think the whole creation of the refugee crisis was part of the design, to drive a million people out, into Europe and promote the neo-fascist parties and stuff that all love Putin.
There's a lot going on in your question. And there are some terms that I think are not accurate, such as the Syrian regime is predominantly at the very top, not all, but predominantly is Alawi, it's not Shi'i. And Alawiism doesn't rule Syria, right? I mean, that's one of the reasons, one of the things that are, I think, are misnomers, even though they have disproportional influence, but they don't, basically in Syria, you don't have Alawi, pro-Alawi policies, right? Alawi communities are as impoverished and in many ways repressed as many others. But yes, the ruling class is disproportionately Alawi. So the sectarian argument is something that I don't support. And I also don't support that if there was a takeover by the opposition, that there will be a massacre of Alawi. I don't support these narratives. I mean, it's also a narrative that we hear in other places, such as Israel. I don't think there will be a massacre. And it all depends, of course, on who is replacing the regime, but things are not as simple. I think that's a narrative that the regime or regime supporters more so peddle in order to scare people into supporting the regime. I think things are much more complex than that. And at the same time, if there is a replacement or if there is an overthrow, things are far less dramatic than what this narrative suggests. But there's a lot in the premise of what you shared that I don't support. So in all cases, I don't see things in sectarian terms, and I don't see those outcomes as I don't see the problem as such. The problem is mainly, in my view, that the uprising in Syria is a legitimate uprising, or the issue is it's a legitimate uprising that was thwarted. So, and then from there, that's when imperialism, and I put this in quotation marks because people mean different things by it, played a role. But in terms of the designs and in terms of how everything was designed decades ago, I'm not a big fan of this rhetoric, because every political actor uses design, the question of designs, to its advantage. And I don't think we have designs anymore. It's obvious what countries are doing. The US invaded and destroyed an entire country, Iraq, in 2003. There were no designs. I mean, it just wanted to do what it did for reasons that were evident. It wanted to remake the Middle East in ways that supports its own politics and the politics of its allies. So I'm not very big on these on some of these designs schemes. I think Rama had a question earlier.
Oh,
Thank you, Bassam. Two questions. One related to Syria and question of Palestine. If you can speak to the impact of the revolution and counter-revolution on Palestinian refugee communities within Syria. And then the second one is kind of related to the problems of discourse that we were talking throughout your talk. I think one particular one, and it relates to maybe it's hard to have hope in this moment, and this part, with Bashar being accepted in the league, the country destroyed. But I think part of what's been frustrating the last decade or so is that so much conversation is about the military, the geopolitics, and many times that just gets the attention. And so the on the ground, what people are doing day to day, both in the immediate of the uprising, but also lasted several years through into, doesn't get as much attention. And how does that then impact then the way we are able to relate when it just becomes, it's too big of a problem, it's geopolitics, I can't engage in this.
So can you just summarize the second point, like what you want me to address, just so I don't misunderstand?
Just in terms of like what it means when the discourse also becomes so much into the military and the battleground and the geopolitics at the expense of what I think is more hopeful in terms of how people are continuing to survive day to day and organize on the ground.
I mean, very quickly, the Palestinian refugees in Syria, of course, like all Syrians, frankly, have actually been subject to the same context of repression, of economic destitution and decline, and all of that prior to the uprising. And I didn't see that there is a significant difference between these communities inside Syria and the rest of Syrians in general. You would find actually people among them that had a different take on the transformation or the change that took place within the uprising, because some people don't like the word transformation, and the change in direction. But I don't think that there is a significant difference between the reaction of the refugees compared to Palestinian refugees in Syria compared to the rest of Syrians. So it could be that based on micro studies, one can actually get a bit deeper, but there's nothing that jumps at you in terms of a statistically significant difference. The problem, of course, is that, you know, people that are twice and thrice displaced, they're going to always be under that much more duress and so on. On the other question, I mean, this is what I'm trying to say. The principal hero and victim in all of this are Syrian people who made sure that they kept their towns and neighborhoods and families alive throughout this, which is something that was completely absent from the media because it was not a sensational thing to cover. But these are the people that actually give hope. And the better or more optimistic development in Syria is that those, and I shared this in the talk, is that those who, including Alawi communities, by the way, that at the time sided with the regime, not all because they support the regime, but also but primarily because they don't like the alternative, are now actually extremely resentful. And there is a sense that if there is a go again, that the social and political learning that took place at all levels, unfortunately also at the regime's level, is going to be in play. But the positive thing about this is that the regime played its cards right in terms of pursuing what it pursued in the most problematic manner, in the most reprehensible manner. But it was able to do that, except that the opposition and many of us didn't. And I think we are to benefit from a reproduction of these circumstances, which everyone now might wonder when this might happen again, not just in the case of Syria, but also in the case of Egypt, for instance, and so on. In my view, as somebody who follows the region and studies it and teaches it and writes about it, I don't think this is happening very soon, at least not in a collective manner across countries. But there is, in my view, a very important task for all of us, and that is to begin establishing forms of solidarity and joint struggle, first of all, that blur boundaries and borders. And that is something that, unfortunately, if you look at what's happening, is not being done. And maybe it's being done within countries, but even within countries, even in the case of Syria, if you look at the NGOization of various pro-human rights or human rights oriented groups, everything is happening at a level that is compartmentalized. And I unfortunately think this doesn't bode well for another circumstance where these conditions reproduce the need to go to the streets, the need to actually, and the need and the capacity to do this. But you know, I'm very hopeful that people are aware that if this indeed does happen again, you will see a very different behavior among not just those who are the natural dissenters, but also among those who, for whatever reason, tried to stick with the devil they knew. And unfortunately, what you are seeing at the level of states and the welcoming back of Syria, and by the way, it's not like Syria is now being welcomed back to Disneyland, it's the Arab League. So it's not like that far off from Syria, although it is far off in some ways. But I'm hopeful theoretically, but in practice, I don't think we're seeing as much movement as we'd like in that direction that you mentioned.
Question.
Well, since we're in the Palestine Center, I thought we would focus more on how the Syrian war has affected the Palestinians. There was quite a large population of Palestinians in Syria. I think it was about 400,000, and they were very well constituted. They had access to social services, education, and employment. So I have two questions. What is the status of the Palestine community today in Syria? And if Assad got overthrown, would that whole support access from Iran through a little bit of Iraq all the way to Hezbollah in Lebanon be interrupted? And would that be sort of fatal to the Palestinian people?
I mean, I already addressed this. I don't think there is a vast difference between the conditions of Palestinians inside Syria and the rest of Syrians, not because of some sort of philosophy of equity, even though the Syrian regime and the prior one have actually treated Palestinians in a far more equitable manner than, say, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon. And that's because, and the reason why there's not much difference is because everyone in Syria is now, I mean, we're talking about 60 to 80%, depending on what you look at in terms of the social statistics, are living under the poverty line. So there isn't much leeway there in terms of addressing differences. As to the second point, in terms of Syria's, you know, if the regime disappears or is overthrown, what does this do to the Palestine question? Well, let's start with what this does to Iran. And in many ways, the collapse of or the failure or the overthrow of the Syrian regime would certainly isolate Iran in ways that are very significant. And if Iran is isolated, then its support for Hezbollah is going to lack the linchpin and the channel through which Iran arms and supports Hezbollah. So that's going to be a huge blow for that country and its politics, whatever these may be, and the connection with Hezbollah. This is one of the reasons why a lot of people were interested in sustaining the Syrian regime, not because of its own sake, but because of what this camp could serve in terms of a balance of power with Israel. Now, this narrative could be a bit inaccurate. My take could be a bit inaccurate, but no one can deny that this camp is now the only camp militarily that poses any threat to the state of Israel or a deterrence to the state of Israel, including Israeli military officials as well as military journalists and scholars.
Oh, okay. I have one more question, and we can conclude after that if it's okay with everyone. I guess I get to have my one question. So this is a sore subject, and usually like the mood isn't like this in the room when we have events about Palestine, talking about, you know, resistance on the ground or the reality of Palestine, or bringing uplifting stories. And I think it's the role of spaces like this is to also have uncomfortable conversations. And I believe that this is this is very important, not because we only care about Palestine, but we also care about our neighbors and our Arab brothers and sisters and about the region. And we don't want to see countries falling apart. We don't want to see civil wars. We don't want to see these things happening. However, do you think after more than a decade of what we have witnessed since the beginning of the Arab uprisings, do you think there is because I want to talk a little bit about agency within the context of these states, within the context of these decision makers, within the context of these countries. Do you think these regimes, these governments that not only Syria, where I'm trying to zoom out a little bit, do you think they learned any lessons on how to avoid getting in situations like the ones we've witnessed throughout the past decade or more? And by that, I mean, some of the arguments that we heard in the past decade or so in approaching the Arab uprisings, and in a comparative sense, meaning that, comparing different countries and the different outcomes that we've witnessed, geopolitics aside, and of course, the interests of outside forces aside, there was a number of Arab intellectuals argued that the more the political space was eliminated within a given country, the more there was a tendency for that country to devolve into that kind of nihilistic, destructive rabbit hole of mutual destruction and the tendency to unleash forces of violence and so on and so forth. Can we say that the existing regimes, whether they were regimes that survived the last decade or regimes that that rose to power as a result of the last decade, are they capable of learning that lesson? Are they capable of understanding that the more these political spaces are eliminated, the more there is an ability for elites, not in the elitist sense, but as leaders within the country, communities within a given country, the civil society, political parties, political forces, to engage in processes of bargaining, of creating, of engaging in decision making that would spare these countries having to go through civil wars and civil strife. Can we say that this lesson has been learned? And what is the role, what is our role as intellectuals, academics, scholars who are interested in the region in creating different ways, different modes of thinking that would allow for that thinking to exist?
Thank you. That's a lot, but let me just try to summarize what I'm assuming you're getting at by saying that what we've learned and what Arab states have learned, because they're smart. Despite what people think, they're smart. They know how to stay on top. What we've learned is that the forces of counter-revolution are much stronger than the forces of revolution in the global South specifically. And this has taken place as a result of the intertwining of intervention/imperialism, called what you will, on the one hand, and authoritarianism on the other, because they, as I shared, which is not something that I delved into because this would have been much longer, they have actually benefited one another and reinforced one another. So what we've learned is that the forces of counter-revolution are far greater, and the tools available to them in terms of economics, in terms of financial support, in terms of weaponry, in terms of the ability strategically and otherwise to thwart movements, in terms of their ability to muddle and play a particular game that presents the lesser evil as desirable, thereby returning back to what was the status quo. These are the sorts of things that we've learned in terms of the power of counter-revolution. If you look at the cases that started in 2011 experiencing mass protests, Syria is back with the Syrian regime in a much of a destitute country, but that actually is a situation where you have a return to the status quo in a much more ugly manner. If you look at Egypt, despite the Egyptian media that sings the praises of Sisi and the Egyptian regime, we also have the return to the status quo that is much worse than the prior status quo, because the prior status quo was one where you understood that it's a repressive regime that has no democratic legitimacy, whereas this one presents itself as being based on some sort of a popular democratic support. And it's a regime that actually tolerates dissent far less. If you look at Bahrain, which lasted a very short period because of the intervention of Saudi Arabia and the silence of Europe and the United States vis-a-vis this intervention, because they don't want that to cause a domino effect, that situation in Bahrain to cause a domino effect in the Arab Gulf for obvious reasons. So we do have a return to the status quo, and that return is a testimony to the importance of that dynamic between authoritarian rule and international intervention, how they reinforce one another. Now, in terms of our role, I mean, I keep getting asked this question. Anybody who speaks keeps getting asked this question, what can we do? I mean, I don't know. I mean, of course, there's a lot that we can do, but the one thing that I always see myself saying is that let's not just wait until crisis erupt for us to basically say something. When Israel bombs Gaza to smithereens, we all get angry and become active in those 2 or 3 or 4 weeks. And then, things move on and, we're done. Even with the Twitter, with tweeting and being on social media, even that becomes more reduced after. There is a need for us to actually, as someone said, and I'm not going to quote them because they changed course. I don't know what's up with people changing course in this world, but I want to quote this person. And he said, there is no alternative to organizing. There is no alternative to organizing. So we can do a lot as individuals, and that's wonderful, but there's no alternative to organizing with each other, but also build bridges with people with similar goals, similar causes, that are not people that look like you, that talk like you, or that have the, basically the same background. I think there is in my talk a serious critique, which I didn't develop on purpose, of the manner in which the world is organized today, the international state system. And I think one of the things that most of us can do is to actually reach beyond the borders of a nation state, but also, unfortunately, right, to also connect within the people that are within your nation state and organize. Those of us who live in the United States, as opposed to, for instance, people who live in Syria, have the freedom to actually organize and to connect and to build bridges so that the next time something happens, we are operating on a much more sound basis of collective action, of collective understanding. And if there is one thing that we all can do, and we have not done during the uprising, especially with sensitive cases, is to try a bit harder, not to just undermine each other, because we have some differences in the way we approach the same goal that we believe in. And that's something that I think would actually have been more effective in supporting or critiquing or putting things on the right path, at least discursively. But I honestly see that there are limits to what we can do as individuals without organizing, without institutions, and without collective action within where we're at and across various settings. And that's basically like saying little, but you're asking a very big question, and I think big questions, don't have really good answers.
And despite that, we have had a great conversation tonight. Professor Bassam Haddad, thank you so much for joining us tonight.